In 1873, a strange letter showed up at the Oregon State Governor's office. No name, stained with water, carrying the smell of rot and something older than death. Inside were lists names of families marked as missing along the trail. But next to every name sat a number, a price tag, a grave site, and at the bottom of the paper, burned into the parchment, was a cross-shaped brand. That letter vanished within hours. The clerk who logged it got reassigned the next morning, and no one dared mention it again until now. Because this isn't just some creepy old story. It's darker. It's a system built on pain, dressed up like salvation, a machine that fed on broken dreams, sickness, and hope. The Grayson family weren't just killers. They designed death to feel like destiny. They handed out blessings like candy, all while ripping kids from their parents and selling off lives like they were goods in a store. The scariest part, no one ever stopped them. Their whole operation was so flawless, so untouchable, it couldn't have been just them. Someone bigger backed them, protected them, used them, because behind every nightmare like this, there's always an institution hiding the truth. You're not just hearing a ghost story tonight. You're stepping into a graveyard, paved over with paperwork, hidden behind fake holiness, and signed off by powerful men. And those men, their tricks, their lies, their ways of controlling people with fear, faith, and trauma, they didn't vanish with the 1800s. They got smarter. What you're about to learn will change how you see churches, charities, government files, via your own family. They changed with time. What you're about to hear will flip how you see charity, religion, government, records, even your own family. So, I'll only ask this once. Do you really want to keep watching? Because there's no happy ending waiting for you, no neat little bow to tie this story together. Only the truth, soaked in blood, buried deep, waiting to crawl out. What comes next is the fall. And once you see how far it goes, you'll never see yourself for the world the same way again. The first thing you need to know is this: the Grayson family didn't do this alone. No predator survives for years without protection. Their church, Sacred Heart, wasn't just a chapel. It was a cover, a theater, a holy slaughterhouse, hidden between the wild and the lawless. But the trees weren't the only shield. Paperwork, silence, and fear guarded them better than walls ever could. The locals, they whispered about Sacred Heart. They knew families went in and never came out. But they also knew speaking up brought the wrong kind of attention. And back then, attention could cost you your land, your kids, your life, your body washing up in the John Day River, face gone, no one left to mourn you. That's the thing about life on the frontier. Fear of the law mixed with blind faith. Father Mariah Grayson used both like weapons. He knew that when people are desperate, when they're sick and scared, they'll follow anyone in a white collar or a dark robe. He mastered the timing when to read scripture, when to close the Bible, when to look a man dead in the eyes, not like a priest, but like a father, like a confessor, like God himself. He was the danger and the protection all in one. Sister Constance, quiet and wide-eyed, played her part like it was second nature. Her soft voice calmed sick kids, while her hands mixed the very poison that would take their last breath. And Ezekiel was the smoothest of them all, the helpful neighbor, the smiling friend, the one who buried the bodies, cleaned the dirt from his shovel, and showed up for breakfast like nothing happened. This wasn't a family, it was a machine. A perfect system where every person had a role. They worked together like parts in a deadly clock, precise, silent, impossible to stop. But here's where it gets worse. They didn't just do this for survival or even money. They kept records, names, ages, what people brought with them, how they reacted when death crept in their emotions, logged like some twisted science project. But those records, they weren't written in plain English. They were in Latin, scribbled with a secret code so ancient it came before the church itself. Now think about it. What kind of killer tracks pain like data? And who were they reporting to? Because those ledgers, they didn't stay buried in Oregon. 100 years later, copies turned up, hidden in a locked vault beneath a seminary on the East Coast. But we'll get to that part. First, you need to know something most people never face. Not every preacher or priest works for God. Some work for control, others for wealth, but a few serve something ancient. The Graysons weren't making this up as they went. Every victim was chosen. Every death followed a plan, and that plan was ritual. So, let's head down to the basement under Sacred Heart Chapel. It's not listed in any official files, but survivors and, eventually, investigators described exactly what they saw. And trust me, it's worse than you think. The floor wasn't just old stone, it was black tiles, not even from Oregon. Symbols carved deep with rusted iron nails, and right in the middle, a circular pit lined with burned bones. This wasn't a basement for storage. It was a sanctum. The victims weren't just killed, they were purified. Their deaths followed patterns, phases of the moon, weird number rituals, ancient feast days twisted into something way older than Christianity. The Graysons weren't just criminals. They practiced a forgotten faith, a belief system that got swallowed up by ancient Rome and repackaged under the cross. Of the Bible, banned gospels the church tried to erase but never completely destroyed. Mariah Grayson had studied every word, and worse, he believed it. One piece of his journal, found at the Grayson house and now locked away at the Oregon Historical Society. The veil. But it is grief that binds the tether. These weren't the words of a crazy man. They were sharp, focused, on purpose. The Graysons weren't just killing for fun. They were trying to open something disturbing. The deaths didn't always happen fast. Some families stayed alive for days, even weeks, slowly falling apart while being cared for. Because it wasn't just about the soul leaving, it was how the soul left. What kind of despair it released. In their messed up belief system, grief wasn't just sadness, it was fuel. And they knew exactly how to harvest it. Think this all sounds impossible? Then explain why the graves behind Sacred Heart Chapel weren't just unmarked. The graves weren't random. They were laid out in a spiral, every distance measured perfectly, every spot pointing toward magnetic north. That's not chance, that's design. And here's the part that really messes with your head. The deeper people dug, the more they realized Sacred Heart wasn't some one-time nightmare. It was one of seven. 7 chapels, 7 families, 7 patterns spread across the western frontier, all linked by a system that never ended, just went underground. And if you think that's ancient history, let me ask you this. How many big institutions today were built by men who once rode the Oregon Trail? And how many of their secrets survived the journey? It always starts the same way. You're exhausted, hungry, lost. Maybe your wife's burning with fever. Maybe your kid hasn't spoken in days. Then, just beyond the trees, he shows up, clean, smiling, holding a Bible and a canteen. He says there's a chapel nearby, just a few miles back, a place to rest, a place to be safe. You want to believe him, and that's how they got you. Because the Graysons' most dangerous weapon wasn't poison, it was hope. Hope is the final trap. Once they've got that, you'll follow them anywhere, even straight into a grave disguised as shelter. Want proof? Let me tell you about the Hoffmans. May 1853. A German immigrant family, 8 people, 3 generations. They survived starvation, storms, even cholera. Their wagon barely held together. Their spirits were crushed. That's when Ezekiel appeared. A few days at Sacred Heart Chapel to rest before they headed to the Willamette Valley. But they never made it. Records show they arrived May 14th. By May 29th, not one Hoffman was alive. But here's where it gets even colder. The Morrisons were poisoned quietly, but the Hoffmans, they were watched. By 1853, the Graysons weren't just killers anymore. They were something worse. From underground, screams buried under the dirt, fires glowing long after midnight, and then nothing. One settler who passed nearby swore he saw a pale light drifting through the chapel windows, not lanterns, but something colder, like moonlight underwater. Sister Constance wrote it all down, doses given, how their minds broke, how their spirits collapsed. She even logged the moment the grandfather begged to die, the moment the mother, delirious, turned on her own kids. All of it written, tracked, studied. So ask yourself, who were they sending those notes to? Who trained them for this? And how did it go on for 36 years without being stopped? I need you to really hear this. Evil never works alone. It always walks hand in hand with silence, and silence, it's always bought and paid for. By 1854, the Graysons weren't just killing for money. This had become organized, ritualized, something much bigger than simple murder. And you can see the shift by watching the visitors. They showed up, well-dressed, healthy, riding in on horses. They weren't lost families or wandering preachers. They were watchers. Men visit Sacred Heart in July of 1854. One carried a leather satchel marked with a strange symbol, an upside-down torch wrapped in a crown of thorns. They stayed 2 days. After they left, everything changed. The killings got faster, the cover stories more believable. Victims disappeared without a trace. Their belongings were cleaned, traded, sold off across Oregon and Idaho. It was clear the Graysons had been given access to something bigger. Let me be real with you. This is how underground networks work. You prove you can lie, control, and erase without hesitation, and the system comes to you. It shields you, feeds you, then pulls you in. The Graysons weren't just killers anymore. They were testing blueprints for control systems that go way back to ancient priest kings and blood cults. Break someone down with sickness. Offer fake hope. Blame it on faith. Take everything of value. Do it again. Sound familiar? Look at your world now. Medical treatments no one's allowed to question. Faith leaders selling salvation on payment plans. Governments handing out debt like it's freedom. None of this is new, it's just evolved. What happened in Oregon wasn't random. It was a trial run. And when the Graysons succeeded, they got what every shadow network craves: money. protection. And the one thing that keeps it all hidden: silence. Because when you serve something bigger, like it's money, your crimes don't get punished, they get hidden. That's why you've never seen this on the news. Even now, parts of Sacred Heart Chapel are still fenced off, labeled as unstable ground by the state. But you and I both know what that really means. They don't want you digging there. Was how they controlled the story. They understood something your teachers never told you. You don't have to chain people to control them. You just have to give them a story, a good one. One that turns horror into holiness, poison into medicine, murder into mercy. Even realizes it's happening. Picture it. Your kids dying. You're in a strange place. No one to help you. You're exhausted, terrified. A woman in white kneels beside your child, crying with you, whispering that God's herbs will save them. Then a man opens a Bible, reads Psalm 23, tells you your child's death is part of God's plan, that heaven is waiting. Now you should be angry, questioning everything, but you're not, because grief scrambles your brain. Pain dulls your instincts, and if someone you trust gives your suffering a reason, you surrender. The Graysons mastered that. They didn't just murder people, they convinced them to believe they were chosen for it, that their suffering was holy, part of some higher plan. That's not just murder, that's programming. And that programming didn't die with the 1800s. Look around. How often does fear get turned into control? How often are you told your suffering is your fault, or worse, God's will? Think about how often schools, companies, even churches sell you peace, but only after they've fed you fear. Sound familiar? It should, because the same mind games the Graysons played using hope, guilt, rituals, grief, and religion haven't gone away. They've just been repackaged for modern life. Now it's hidden in your ads, your social feeds, your politics, your sermons. But back in 1854, it was raw, unfiltered, and deadly. The Graysons figured out something terrifying about the human brain. When you're hurting, you'll reach for a savior. And if someone shows up at the right moment, says the right words, wears the right mask, you'll trust them, even if they're the ones who set the fire you're running from. Because real control doesn't need chains. It needs belief twisted, weaponized, buried under silence. The American West wasn't just brave pioneers and shiny dreams. That's the fairy tale, the flag-waving version kids grow up hearing. But under all that, it was about blood, conquest, and quiet deals made in shadows. The Graysons weren't some freak accident. They were part of the system. Every murdered family meant one less person standing in the way, one more empty plot of land, one less legal headache for expansion. Manifest destiny. It wasn't some inspiring idea, was a calculation, and death was the shortcut. When the Graysons erased a family, guess who profited? County clerks, judges, merchants, surveyors, all the people who stayed quiet because they had land and money to gain. That's how the cycle works. Blood clears the land. Silence keeps the records clean, and the system keeps moving without questions. Even when rumors of missing people started spreading, even when a few brave settlers filed official complaints, the files vanished. Testimonies were misplaced. Evidence went up in flames. Same story every time. Here's the hard truth. When enough powerful people benefit from a crime, it stops being called a crime. It becomes policy. You still live in that world. Think about it. When whole towns disappear after an economic crash, who cashes in? When medicine fails and lawsuits vanish, who gets richer? When wars are sold with lies, who signs the checks? History doesn't repeat because people forget. It repeats because someone profits when we do. The Grayson Chapel wasn't just a horror story. It was a test run away to see how far you can break people and what they'll believe to avoid the truth. And the worst part, most people never break, they obey. They play along because the system teaches you to fear questioning more than death itself. That's how real evil survives, not with monsters and flames, but with silence, paperwork, and people in clean suits. So next time you hear a story that feels wrong, ask yourself who benefits if you believe it. By 1860, the Graysons had buried over 200 souls. Not once did anyone investigate them. Why? Because true evil doesn't need to run, it passes itself down. You see, the real legacy of families like the Graysons isn't carved on graves. It's built into institutions, law firms, banks, churches, political families. When you picture a serial killer, you imagine some creepy loner in the woods. You never picture a smiling family in church clothes standing at the front pew. But that's exactly where evil hides in legacy. The Grayson bloodline didn't just disappear. They thrived. New names, new careers, a whole new generation that learned from their ancestors not how to kill but how to control, how to hide behind respectability like a shield, how to bury their family's history under charity work and polished reputations. We tracked one descendant to a federal judge. Another owns a huge stake in a defense company. Another sits on the board of a private university, the same university where the ciphered Grayson ledgers were found locked in a basement during a renovation in 1974. You still think this is just some old creepy story? You still think what happened stayed buried in Oregon? Here's the part no one warns you about: real evil doesn't die. It files taxes, it donates to charities, it reinvents itself, and it trains its kids how to wear the mask, how to smile for cameras while standing on a pile of bones. And that should scare you more than poison or murder ever could. A killer you can understand, but a man who inherits power built on death and turns it into law, that's a whole different kind of monster. The Graysons weren't just monsters of history. They were the blueprint for what came next. Men who figured out that with the right costume, a priest's robe, a politician's suit, a professor's degree, you can do anything, even genocide. So when you wonder why nobody stopped them, take a good look around. They didn't have to be stopped. They were absorbed. Now they live inside the systems you believe in. But in 1871, something happened they didn't expect. Someone got away. Her name was Clara Bowden, 17, from Illinois. She and her little brother were traveling west with their uncle's family. Their oxen collapsed near Dead Man's Ridge. The Graysons took them in. 10 days later, Clara was the only one still breathing and she ran. We only know pieces of what happened, found in her diary and a few interviews taken years later in a women's shelter in San Francisco. But what she wrote down is more terrifying than any ghost story. They smiled when they killed. That's the part she couldn't forget. It wasn't rage or madness, it was calm, like they'd done it 100 times and would do it 100 more. Clara described the moment she found the basement not by chance, but by following the sound of music. But it wasn't church songs. it wasn't prayers, it was something older. Something that, in her words, felt like it knew my name before I was even born. When she opened that door, she didn't just find the dead. She found people live, tied up, gagged, barely breathing. Clara ran before they saw her. She sprinted barefoot through the forest for nearly 40 miles, bleeding, starving, until she collapsed at the door of a logging camp, half dead. And what did the law do when she told them? They called her insane. Why? Because she wasn't just accusing the Graysons of murder, she was accusing a chapel, a family, a sacred institution. And that's the one line nobody crosses. Because if people believed Clara, they'd start questioning everything: the churches, the charities, the rich families with land and silence passed down like an inheritance. So they silenced her. They locked her away, drugged her, ruined her name. But one thing survived her words, scribbled in red ink along the edges of her diary, written twice. They do not kill for death. They kill for silence. And that's the truth most people can't face. The real danger isn't murder, it's forgetting. They tried to erase what happened, but some echoes never fade. After Clara's escape, whispers spread like wildfire, candlelit rumors in dusty taverns, scared talk in saloons across the frontier. But anytime someone tried to investigate, the same thing happened: a missing file, a burned journal, a judge gone missing when subpoenas arrived. Even the deputies who asked questions vanished like they were never there. And then the bodies started washing up along the banks of the John Day River, stripped of clothes, marked with symbols carved into their skin. But these weren't Grayson symbols. They were older, darker, like they belonged to something bigger than just one family. That's when people realized this wasn't just about murder or money. It was a power struggle, a hidden war for control. Imagine the fear on the frontier. These people had already watched land claims stolen, treaties shattered, the gold rush turn into a bloodbath. Now they faced a secret network that felt untouchable, a legacy so deep even the law couldn't reach it. But fear, the Graysons understood, cuts both ways. When people get pushed far enough, fear turns to rebellion. In late 1872, a small group of settlers, a few farmers, a blacksmith, an ex-soldier made a vow, repeating Clara's words like a battle cry. They would find the Graysons and burn the chapel to the ground. Under cover of night, with torches and shaking hands, they rode in. The chapel sat silent, the little town around it abandoned. The graveyard gates creaked open, and fresh graves looked like they were waiting for them. Inside, they found ruins: a shattered cup, burned wooden beams, walls scratched with Latin words, twisted into something dark. But no Graysons, no bodies, just an empty, silent place that seemed to breathe fear. They ran to never spoke again. The soldier vanished. The blacksmith's wife died in a wagon crash. The others returned home with nothing but dread in their eyes. Because the Graysons' most dangerous weapon wasn't poison or knives. It was terror. And terror doesn't burn away with fire. It grows with whispers, with silence, with the sick feeling that something still holds the key to your fear. So when you wake up tomorrow, ask yourself, who holds yours? Which system? Which story? Ask yourself, who decided suffering is part of some grand plan? And what secret symbols still hide in the margins of their holy books? Because once you start seeing the cracks in the story, you'll understand the real horror isn't death. It's knowing your doubt is the next thing they'll bury. You're still listening. That tells me something most people never admit. You're ready. But before we go further, do one thing for you, not for views or clicks. Scroll down and type these 3 words twice. Silence is currency. Silence is currency. Because real change doesn't start with belief. This is yours now. You're not just watching a story. You're part of the fight against it. Pay attention, because what I'm about to say got men killed for repeating it. In 1875, hidden behind the Sacred Heart Chapel's altar, they found a sealed ledger. Inside, coded names, strange symbols, Latin prayers, hundreds of names, not just victims, but judges, bankers, railroad bosses, sheriffs, men who built the system you still live in. The Graysons weren't some backwoods cult. They designed control. They created a quiet system of soft elimination, a way to drain people's hope, their money, their memory, without ever firing a shot. And that system, it didn't die, it was bought. One line in Mori Grayson's handwriting stood out. A soul taken in grief makes a finer tether than one taken in fear. That's the secret ancient empires understood. It's the piece of history the church wants you to forget. Tether. That word would show up again decades later, buried in CIA files, Stanford lab research, secret military patents on emotional warfare, because tethering is real. It's the art of tying belief to trauma so tight the victim becomes loyal to the one who hurt them. That's not a conspiracy. That's psychological warfare. The Graysons didn't invent this. They just rediscovered it. But where did it really come from? That's what you're about to learn. Because their source wasn't God, and it wasn't insanity. It was something much older, hidden long before Oregon, buried beneath ancient Rome, whispered across Babylon, carved onto forgotten tablets dragged from the Tigris River, and locked away by men terrified of what they found, the same knowledge, now being used to control you. Still think this is just about one creepy family. Still think it ends with an old chapel. Good. That means you're finally ready for the next part. We're not going back to 1852, we're going back to 1250 BC, to a lost city buried under centuries of war, religion, and sand. Kutha, a Sumerian city built by slaves for one reason, to worship a god, but not a god of love or peace, a god of gates. His name was Nergal, ruler of the underworld, keeper of the boundary between life and death, the god who smiled only when plague spread and families were broken. The priests of Nergal controlled people by blending suffering with salvation. They poisoned wells, then sold fake cures. They made the healthy sick, then promised healing. Sound familiar? Now, picture this. The Graysons' rituals, their language, even how they built Sacred Heart Chapel, all perfectly matched ancient blueprints discovered on clay tablets during a band dig in southern Iraq back in 1926. Those tablets, sealed away by the British Museum, never shown to the public. Why? Because they describe death systems identical to what the Graysons pulled off thousands of years later. And there's one line from those tablets that still chills me. The hand that heals must first touch the poison, for only then will the soul binds itself to the priest. That's tethering. That's control. That's exactly what the Graysons didn't, exactly what powerful groups still do today. But how did this ancient knowledge crawl its way back to a quiet patch of Oregon? That's the question that's cost men their jobs, their reputations, and in at least 2 cases, their lives. Because the truth is, someone or something that knowledge preserved it and passed it on. The Sacred Heart Chapel wasn't built by accident. Its design matches the long-lost temple of Eslam in Kwa, an ancient site buried by time. The inverted altar, the underground chamber, the graves arranged in perfect rings. It wasn't Christian. It was something older, a blueprint of neurospiritual control designed to do more than connect life and death. It was built to blur the line between control and consent. You're seeing it now, aren't you? The Graysons weren't masterminds, they were messengers. The system you live under wasn't built for your benefit, was built on top of your obedience. Every great empire invents a myth to keep people quiet. Rome promised divine rule. Egypt dangled the afterlife. And America sells you freedom. But the second you define freedom, you can manipulate it. That's what the Graysons figured out. That's what the architects of Kwa perfected. That's what every modern institution keeps milking. Redefine freedom as safety, then manufacture the threat. Scare people just enough, and they'll give up anything. Want proof? In 1878, buried in a redacted Oregon government memo, a traveling preacher named Samuel Ketteridge described meeting Father Morai Grayson. Ketteridge wrote, "Men don't fear hell anymore. They fear uncertainty, and we give them certainty. That's how control works." Then they made them pay for it. Let that sink in. The Graysons weren't just killers, they were builders of dependence. They offered healing, but only if you pledged loyalty. They gave you shelter, but only after stripping you of your possessions. They promised forgiveness, but only if you surrendered your will. And that system, it never vanished. It's hiding in plain sight. Your health care, your student loans, your churches, your corporations, even your democracy. Here's the real game. We've been taught to mistake permission for freedom, to believe we're free because we get to pick between 2 options rigged by the same system. We've been told our suffering has purpose because a politician, a priest, or some expert in a fancy suit says so. But the moment you let someone else define your pain, the moment you hand over your right to question to a professor, a pastor, a leader, you're not free. You're tethered, and the Graysons perfected that. Submission, not through violence, but through comfort. They didn't lie to their victims. They just softened the truth, dressed it up with scripture, sang it with kindness, and people bought it just like they do now. So ask yourself, how many of the comforts you cling to are really chains? How many of the voices you trust are just expensive echoes of silence? The moment you recognize those voices is the moment you start breaking free. Because control doesn't last through fear, it survives through legacy. When Sacred Heart Chapel was finally abandoned in 1888, the papers blamed the weather, claimed the building rotted away. But that's not what happened. The truth, the Graysons were done with it. They didn't need old wood and dirt anymore. Their system had outgrown the chapel. They figured out how to evolve, how to trade crosses for contracts, how to replace sermons with universities. The Grayson legacy didn't vanish, just changed addresses, blending into trust funds, secret clubs, and charity groups that still operate today under shiny names and perfect reputations. And with every new disguise, their system got harder to spot. It didn't look like murder anymore, it looked like progress. Here's something real. In 1982, buried in the Library of Congress under mislabeled farm zoning files, a document surfaced. Financial records tracing straight back to the Grayson Trusta private fund quietly connected to land leases, medical patents, and massive university donations. But this wasn't just about money. It was about preserving an ideology. The same ideology Marai Grayson scribbled in his journals centuries ago. A soul broken by fear never questions the hand that feeds it. Sound familiar? Because today you're told you're free, but only if you play by invisible rules. Credit scores, medical requirements, standardized tests, ideological loyalty oaths, disguised as diversity training. You think this stuff is modern? It's not. It's just a polished version of what started in a wooden chapel built on stolen ground, designed by a man who knew that if you connect suffering to morality, people will control themselves. That's why they don't need chains today, just shame, debt, and carefully crafted stories. And the scariest part, you've learned to love it. The system feeds on you, and you thank it for the scraps, your grades, your paycheck, your monthly rewards for following the script. So ask yourself, when was the last time you really questioned the institutions shaping your beliefs? If you haven't, congratulations, the system still works exactly the way it was designed. This is where most people stop listening, where they choose comfort over truth. Because after hearing this, you can't unsee it. This stopped being a story about the Graysons a long time ago. This is your story now. About the prison you were born into, the one you've been taught to call freedom. Let's talk about conditioning. Since you were a kid, you've been told the systems around you exist to keep you safe, schools to teach you, the news to inform you, the state to protect you, the church to save you. But what if all of those systems weren't designed for your safety, but for your submission? Marai Grayson wasn't crazy. He was a system builder. He figured out that chains aren't necessary if you build a routine. Violence isn't needed if you create ritual obedience. And secrecy, it's pointless when the truth is too terrifying for most people to face. Think about this. Why do schools have bells? Why do governments demand pledges? Why do churches chant in unison? These aren't random. They're tools, entrainment devices designed to strip away individuality and replace it with synchronization. The same forced unity the Graysons used during their so-called healing ceremonies. Victims were ordered to repeat verses before drinking Sister Constance's remedies, chanting over and over, "God's will is greater than mine." And by the time the poison set in, they didn't resist because they had already agreed to die. Now look at your own life. Look at what you agree to every day. Terms you never read, rules you never questioned, stories you just accept. That's the real poison now. It doesn't kill your body, it erodes your will. And once that's gone, you're not living, you're functioning, just like the Graysons wanted. Their greatest weapon wasn't murder. It was obedience wrapped as salvation. That's why this story still matters. Because if you can't recognize the ritual you've been trapped inside, you'll never break free. But the moment you do, that's when you start cutting the tether. And that, my friend, is the most dangerous act you can take in a world built on silence. To understand the system, to see how the Graysons operated for nearly 40 years without being exposed, you have to think like them. not just their methods, but their beliefs. Because they never saw murder as wrong, they saw it as necessary, not for greed, but for order. Grayson believed the world was a collapsing structure held together by fragile illusions. His hidden journals, still locked away in a private vault in Maine, spell it out clearly. He wrote, "There is no good, no evil, only structure and decay. God is not a father, God is a ledger. Let that sink in." To Marai, every human being was just a transaction. Every family, a balance sheet. If a group arrived weak, sick, broken in spirit, they weren't seen as people. They were liabilities, and removing them wasn't murder. It was optimization. Horrifying, sure, but now compare that to the systems you live under. How many policies are defended in the name of efficiency? How many lives reduced to data points? How often are tragedies brushed aside with budget cuts and performance metrics? It's the same doctrine, just updated, digitized, legalized. Morai had 3 rules. First, the burden must be lightened. Eliminate the weak to strengthen the whole. Second, illness wasn't just sickness, it was failure. Third, the soul must consent. The victims had to submit willingly, through ritual, prayer, or surrender. The illusion of choice was critical. And finally, the tether must remain. Survivors had to carry guilt, gratitude, or awe toward their oppressors. That's how control survives. The same rules exist today, but now they wear masks called policy, progress, and charity. That's the real genius of the system. It teaches you to love the ones destroying you. Just look around. How many people defend the same corporations that bleed them dry? How many citizens worship leaders who see them as disposable? How many trust institutions that would toss them aside the moment they stop being useful? That's not loyalty. That's psychological debt, an invisible chain passed down like an inheritance. The Graysons understood that. They built it, and today it thrives because most people still cling to the fantasy of moral leadership, even while choking on the poison disguised as progress. You've heard about MK Ultra, the CIA's twisted mind control experiments, the drugs, the trauma, the manipulation. But what no one tells you is those roots run deeper than the 1950s. They trace back to 1883, when a private investigator named Elijah Kerwin stumbled on a collection of notes hidden in the ruins of Sacred Heart Chapel. Those notes weren't spiritual or religious. They were clinical, step-by-step instructions for breaking a human mind and rebuilding it in chains of obedience. The perfect order of suffering. First, take their food, then their sleep, then their loved ones. The ideal timing. Let grief sink in just long enough to turn suggestion into submission. The method. Low frequency sound to disrupt brain function. And most important, forced rituals disguised as healing to cement the tether. Kerwin tried to publish what he found. 3 days later, he was dead, gunshot, no investigation. His research didn't disappear though. It landed in the hands of Dr. Charles Walker, a traveling neurologist with early ties to secret psychiatric experiments. His great-grandson. He ended up working for the U.S. military on a project called Operation Artichoke, the prototype for MK Ultra. So ask yourself, how much of what you think you know about control, obedience, even freedom, was engineered generations before you were born? It's not a coincidence when the 1963 MK Ultra files mentioned the Grayson family under the code name Harvest Doctrine. They weren't seen as criminals, they were seen as innovators. The government didn't want to punish them, they wanted to learn from them, and learn they did. They swapped out sermons for electrodes, replaced poison with pills, traded grief rituals for scripted therapy. But the mission stayed the same: break the subject, rebuild the subject, control the subject. Now they've taken it global through your social media feeds, your entertainment, your schools that reward quiet obedience over real curiosity. The tether doesn't hide in medicine bottles or communion wine anymore. It hides in the algorithm. It watches, waits for that moment when your oxen break, when your family falls apart, when you're just desperate enough to grab the comfort, the easy lie, the leash. And once you do, it tightens, because blood remembers. That's what the Graysons carved into history, not with ink or scripture, but with legacy. Evil doesn't die, it relocates. When the chapel burned down in 1888, people thought the Grayson bloodline was gone, but it wasn't. It just disappeared underground. And if you know where to look, you'll still find their fingerprints all over the most powerful families in America. Start with the Lair Foundation, founded in 1903, supposedly to help orphans from the frontier. Look closer, its founders, two brothers directly descended from Ezekiel Grayson, through a cousin who changed her last name after fleeing to Illinois. Today, that same foundation controls over $600 million in assets investments in pharmaceuticals, private schools, defense, technology. One of their board members, a sitting U.S. senator with direct influence over national intelligence oversight. That's not ancient history, that's your present. Still think this is just some old story? Then look at the Harbor Institute for Trauma Recovery, that so-called elite behavioral research center, founded in 1954, the same one with a charter signed by men tied directly to MK Ultra and the earliest CIA mind control experiments. But buried in those old payroll records is the name Ruth Constance Adler, a direct descendant of Sister Constance Grayson. Same middle name, same expertise. She didn't work with sermons, and Tishi worked with plants and chemicals, disguised as wellness, branded as naturopathy. They never stopped what they were doing, they just updated the language. No more chapels. Now it's policy papers. No more poisoned communion. Now it's poisoned narratives. And that's how generational power survives, by evolving. The Grayson bloodline never vanished. It lives in elite universities, in pharmaceutical patents, locked behind armed labs, in DARPA-funded research projects, where trauma isn't healed, it's tracked and dissected. So when you feel the world spiraling, when you notice fear is more profitable than truth, when every disaster seems perfectly timed to introduce another rule, another drug, another leash, no, that's not chaos, that's control. You are witnessing the next evolution of a system born in a decaying wooden chapel with arsenic tea and hymns of submission, now thriving in biometric scanners, predictive AI, and apps that track your loyalty. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is continuity, the only real change. The gatekeepers traded their robes for designer suits, and you invite them into your life with every click. You think emotion is weakness? Only if someone else writes your emotions for you. That's the final trick the Grayson perfected. The thing today's power brokers turned into a science. Emotional control is population control, not through guns or curfews, but through stories, headlines, scripts designed to hijack your biology without you ever realizing it. and Grayson knew exactly how to do it. In his final journal, hidden away before the chapel burned, he described a ritual called the Passion Lock. It wasn't some ancient ritual. It was a system, a sequence designed to break you and bind you. First, they gave hope a soft bed, kind words, a prayer that promised healing. Then came the loss, something precious ripped away, maybe a child, maybe a parent. After that, guilt whispers that it was God's plan, that you deserved this pain. And finally, gratitude. Thank the very people who destroyed you for their comfort. The victim, confused and broken, would tether their identity to the same hands that caused their suffering. Why? Because that emotional roller coaster, hope, loss, guilt, gratitude, creates addiction. The exact same addiction you live with today. Every time you pick up your phone, you scroll, you hope for something good, you rage at what you see, you feel powerless, and then grateful when someone speaks your anger out loud. But that cycle isn't natural, it's designed. Just look at the 24-hour news. It's the same Grayson sequence. First, elation, a breakthrough, a cure, hope for change. Then loss, a tragedy, a disaster, something stolen. Then guilt, it's your fault. You didn't vote. You didn't do enough. Finally, gratitude. Thank the experts. Trust the system. Obey. It's the passion lock, modernized, automated, scaled globally. And the chemicals. Real. Cortisol, dopamine, serotonin. Every headline, every suggested post, every breaking story isn't just news, it's a dose, a hit, engineered to condition you. The same way Sister Constance's remedies weren't healing but neurotoxins disguised as comfort. And the worst part, you've been programmed to love it, to crave the outrage, to feel alive when you're scared, to feel safe when someone powerful says, "We've got this." But that comfort, it costs you everything: your freedom to feel, your power to think, your ability to act without someone else writing the script. That's what they've stolen from you, what the Grayson family perfected, and what still tightens around your life like a noose. But let's tear the rest of the mask off. What you're about to hear isn't some theory, it's a framework, the blueprint that controls how you think, how you question, how you exist. It's called the four-gate system, and it started with the Graysons. Grayson wasn't satisfied with obedience. He wanted predictability. A world where every person, every family, every victim walked the same path without even realizing it. So he built the gates for psychological checkpoints, designed to strip resistance and breed submission. And the terrifying part, that system never went away, just evolved. It's not etched into chapel walls anymore. It's coded into your schools, your apps, your algorithms. Listen carefully and ask yourself, which gate has you trapped? Date 1. The gate of comfort, the illusion of safety. They hand you softness, entertainment, endless scrolling, easy answers. You mistake convenience for trust. Soft pillows before the blade falls. Gate 2. The gate of confusion. Mixed messages, contradictory truths, logic crumbles. You see suffering, but they call it healing. You lose rights, but they call it progress. Sound familiar? Redefining justice, health, even reality itself, until confusion feels like normal. Gate 3. The gate of guilt. Suddenly, you're the villain. You didn't pray enough. You didn't vote the right way. You didn't follow the script. You start to self-police, afraid to speak, afraid to question, because now the leash isn't on your neck, it's in your mind. social pressure, cancellation, reputation scores, purity tests. This is how they make obedience feel like your own idea. And most people, they never even see the gates. They just walk through them smiling. Gate 4, the gate of gratitude, the last and darkest stage of control. It's where the victim doesn't just accept the system. They defend it, worship it, fight for it, completely blind to the chains around their neck. Just like the Grayson's victims, poisoned and dying, still wept with gratitude. People today sing praises for the very systems that would abandon them the second they stop being useful. That's the real trap. Grayson didn't invent this. He just perfected it. And now entire nations walk willingly through those same 4 gates: comfort, confusion, guilt, gratitude, until they're too broken to question it and too scared to want freedom, even when that freedom could save them. If you've stuck around this long, you're already different, but that's not enough. You have to lock it in. Prove to yourself you've seen through the lie. Comment these words twice. The tether is cut. The tether is cut. Say it out loud if you have to. You're not just a viewer anymore. You're reclaiming the pieces they stole from you. Even the most dangerous predators bleed. Even the most powerful monsters can't escape their own reflection. And that's what makes this story more than history. It's a mirror. Somewhere deep inside Mori Grayson, buried beneath his sermons, rituals, and poison, was a truth he couldn't outrun. He saw himself in every man he destroyed. That's why he documented everything, not just the deaths, but their eyes, their final looks, the whispered prayers, the desperation. He wasn't writing history. He was writing his own collapse. In his private ledger, he once scribbled the words, "The more I remove the weak, the more I see the frailty in myself. Every burial is a rehearsal." That's the ugly truth about power. You conquer to feel strong, but every conquest leaves you hollower than before. And eventually, if you're honest, you realize the only thing you ever wanted to destroy was the weakness you couldn't bear to face in yourself. That's why they never stop. Because no amount of control can silence that fear. Sound familiar? That's exactly what modern addiction looks like. Maybe not to drugs, but to control, to followers, to applause, to the fake comfort of recognition that robs you of purpose and leaves you chasing clicks instead of truth, validation instead of sovereignty. It's all designed to keep you obedient, to trick you into thinking you're winning when really you're just performing for scraps while your spine gets stripped away one piece at a time. That's what happened to Mori Grayson. Praised as a savior of the trail, thanked by poisoned men with their dying breath, but in the end, he couldn't even control himself. Power turned into a loop, and the man who thought he was in control ended up lost inside his own mind. Mori didn't die in handcuffs or from exposure. He died insane, locked in the cellar of the Sacred Heart Chapel, scrawling the same sentence over and over on the walls in his own blood. He is me, I am him. He is me, I am him. And that's when he finally saw the monster and the victim were never two different people. They were always the same. And if you're not careful, that'll be your story too. Because real power isn't about bending others. It's about facing your own shadow before it consumes you. The fire that destroyed the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1888 wasn't justice. It wasn't closure. It was a cover-up. You've been fed the lie that vigilantes burned it down, that the Graysons were exposed and stopped, but there were no arrests, no bodies, no names in the records, only a fire and a silence so heavy it echoed across eastern Oregon, because the Graysons had become too valuable. You really think mass murderers disappear from history? Only the sloppy ones. The Graysons weren't sloppy. Their methods, the ledgers, the rituals, the psychological blueprints, they weren't buried, they were preserved. A month after the fire, 2 men arrived from Washington, D.C., their names erased from every transit log. They questioned settlers, gathered what little evidence was left, and quietly took away something they called legacy documents from the burned ruins. But these men weren't lawmen. They were early agents from what would later become the Bureau of Psychological Operations, the foundation of the CIA's Behavioral Division. Think about that for a second. No official investigation, no news headlines, no public trial, because the system didn't care about justice, it cared about control. Once they took what they wanted, they erased everything else. The few remaining witnesses were either bought off, silenced, or dismissed as crazy. Their kids and grandkids who tried to speak up were laughed at as conspiracy nuts or frontier storytellers. But the truth never stays buried. In 1921, a missionary in Idaho claimed to meet a man who matched Father Murray's description, weaker, but still quoting the same twisted scriptures word for word. In 1959, a grad student researching Oregon Trail legends found baptismal records signed by Sister Constance 6 years after she was supposed to be dead. Then in 2003, a private land survey revealed a mass grave behind the old chapel site with over 70 skeletons, most of them kids, some arranged in clear ritual patterns. No arrests, no media coverage. The land was bought by a private firm and sealed off. That's how real power handles truth, not by fighting it, but by locking it away. Because some truths are too useful to destroy. You really think your thoughts are your own? Let me shatter that illusion. The same tactics used to wipe the Grayson story erasure, ridicule, distraction are being used on your mind right now. Not in dark rooms, but through your phone. You're being trained to silence yourself, not with threats of violence, but with the fear of being alone. Murray Grayson understood this long before modern intelligence agencies ever wrote it down. The most effective prison, he said, isn't built with walls. It's built inside your mind. The cage isn't made of bars anymore. It's built from hesitation, silence, and fear. And most people are trapped inside without even seeing it. Every time you stop yourself from speaking what you believe, every time you rewrite a post, delete a comment, stay quiet in a room full of lies just to avoid the fallout, you're tightening the lock on that cage. And here's the sick part. The system never had to silence you. You do it to yourself now. Self-censorship is the highest form of control because it turns every person into their own jailer. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly. That's not appropriate. Don't offend anyone. That's misinformation. Trust the experts. Slowly, your instincts were called hate, your questions labeled dangerous, your doubts turned into thought crimes. But the one thing they'll never admit: silence doesn't protect society, it protects corruption. The Graysons thrived in silence, just like today's predators do. But now they don't need poison or sermons. They use labels: conspiracy theorist, toxic, dangerous, anti-this, phobic, that one word. And suddenly, your voice, your warning. Your truth is buried under shame and mockery. That's not random. That's a control system designed by psychologists, enforced by peer pressure, polished by algorithms that reward obedience and punish dissent. You're not free, you're filtered. And every time you stay silent, just to avoid the backlash, you're rebuilding the same chapel, brick by brick, with your own hands. But this isn't a reckoning of history or politics. This is your reckoning. Because the Graysons may be long dead, the chapel burned to ash, the files buried under Langley, but the real prison, it's still alive inside you. And it was never just about fear, it was about identity. From the moment you could understand words, you were being shaped, told who to be polite, follow the rules, don't question authority, trust the system. And little by little, they built a version of you that wouldn't fight back. A man who follows the rules, plays along, smiles while suffocating, laughs when he should be outraged, lowers his head when he should stand tall. That's the last trick of the Grayson doctrine, not to end your life, but to overwrite it, to mold you into a willing participant who mistakes obedience for freedom. Every time you bite your tongue when the truth burns inside you, every time you trade purpose for comfort, every time you silence that quiet voice screaming that this is wrong, you become part of their legacy. But here's the one thing they can't stand. You don't have to stay trapped. You can wake up now, because your identity isn't some fixed label stamped on you at birth. It's shaped in the choices you make under pressure, not in the lies whispered to you in the dark. The moment you call out what's been done to you, the moment you refuse to play the part they wrote for you, the moment you choose to cut the leash and carve your own path, that's the moment their control fractures. You want real power? It starts the second you stop begging for permission to exist, the second you reject a system built to harvest your life and decide to become the kind of person who can't be owned. A man who's dangerous, not because he destroys, but because he sees clearly and speaks when others stay quiet, who makes choices others are too scared to face, and who will walk alone if he must, but never bows again. Because once you remember who you are, they can't erase you. Not with fire, not with silence, not with shame. This is the final step, the descent into the unknown, and the rise into something they can never control. Not because it's louder, but because it's awake. You've walked through their history, seen the poison disguised as comfort, watched good men disappear, not just into graves, but into systems that fed on their silence. And now you stand where they stood, not at the edge of death, but at the edge of choice. Because this story was never just about the Graysons, it's always been about you. It's about legacy, theirs and yours. They left behind a system built to control, but you get to decide whether you'll leave behind another echo of their pattern or finally be the break in the chain. You're either the next obedient follower, sleepwalking through life, or the one who strikes the match and watches their false chapel burn. This world begs for your compliance, your comfort, your applause, your quiet surrender. But if you've made it this far, if you're still listening, something inside you refuses to kneel. A voice older than your name, louder than your fears, a memory buried under every lie they fed you. You feel it now, that steady clarity beneath the anger, that quiet knowing beneath the noise, that truth they never wanted you to find. Now that it's in you, you don't turn back. You can't unknow. You can't unsee. You don't shrink yourself to fit back into a system built to consume you. You walk different now. You speak different. You carry the weight they couldn't. Sharpen it into a blade of truth they can't comprehend. And when you face yourself in the mirror, you don't see the tamed, silenced version of you anymore. You see the man they feared would survive. The man no algorithm can box in. The man who stands his ground even when he stands alone. This is your chapel now, your fire, your choice. Your blood remembers. And from this moment on, you are unclaimed. If this story stirred something ancient in your chest, remember, silence is how they won. Voice is how you return. Comment again, the tether is cut, and let them try to bury that. Because this isn't just another story. It's a signal to every man still waiting in the dark. You're not alone anymore.